Okay, let's talk about water just a little bit. I'm going to go through this quickly because I don't know how many of you are doing water, and I don't think it matters that much um, in in terms of like if you have to paint something really specific with water, you're going to want reference for it. But these are ways that you can get a water effect quickly if you just need it in this if it's not a highly involved thing, you can actually toss water in your scene pretty easily with these ideas. So we won't talk a whole lot about waves other than that they um, when you have two different waves, they have a tendency to interact with each other if they cross each other. So if you've got two peaks, then they're going to be bigger. If you've got a peak and a trough of a wave, they're going to negate each other. And two troughs, of course, will be deeper. And so if you ever get these crisscrossing patterns, like you see in these two examples, you actually get the ripples will crisscross each other, and where they intersect, you end up with these peaks that you're familiar with when you see open ocean images where you have these kind of like almost like mountain peak type things. It's because this type of thing is happening with multiple intersecting waves, right? And that the reason why it pulls in that direction is just because water is heavy and it has a tendency to like sink and pull out of the waves as much as it can. So the energy exhibits itself in that type of way with the peak on top. It is possible to get waves that are different shapes, but that's kind of the most natural way that they want to move. So you never want to paint water that has no ripples on it, that has no distortion, because it takes kind of a special set of circumstances for it to be perfectly mirror-like. And so I guess if you are painting that specific set of circumstances, go for it. But other than that, create some distortion in there. The distortions are going to happen horizontally. Now, they don't really happen horizontally, but because perspective kind of squashes things in depth, right? You get a bunch of waves that are, even circular, and they become, you can see that sort of happening here. We get this kind of vertical squishing that's happening with the waves. And what that causes, if you get very much of that, is anisotropic reflections. So you get a texture that the grain is going this way, and so the reflection gets stretched out to the opposite axis. Just like a highlight on hair, you end up with, especially in the distance here, you see that vertical stretching that's happening. You don't see it as much with these bigger waves, but you can definitely see it here. It's almost like instead of, here you're actually getting a specific reflection of the mountain. Here you get kind of a smudge where the mountain is. You get this slight darkening near the edge, and that's just because those waves are a little bit stronger, and the anisotropic reflection effect is happening more strongly. Also, because of the angle, so depending on what your viewing angle is, if you're down low, you're looking up at this wall of the waves, and if you're up high, you're looking at this wall of the waves. And with water, you have the Fresnel effect happening probably in the strongest way that you see it, that you'll see it anywhere. I don't know if water is special in that way or if it's just that you get these gigantic surfaces that you can see it on. But in water, what that exhibits itself as is that if you're looking down, you can see clearly into the water with very minimal reflection. And if you're looking off into the distance, you get almost complete reflection of whatever's back there. It's not complete, it's not total 100% reflection. So you will drop in value going from the water to the landscape. But you definitely, you see that transition. Here you can see the rocks, back in the distance you can't anymore. So we won't talk a lot about ocean waves. They are interesting. But what we will talk about is how whitewater is whipped up. So when you have water being churned up, it creates little tiny bubbles. And any individual little bubble creates a new surface. Whether it's under the water or outside of the water, it creates a new surface, and that surface is specular. That surface is going to reflect the sun, it's going to reflect the sky, it's going to reflect everything else, right? If you have a whole bunch of those, the light adds on top of itself. And so you end up with something that's reflecting a lot of light. In fact, if you want to do a test with this, get some cellophane, some plastic wrap, and wrap it once around something, and wrap it twice around something, and wrap it a whole bunch of times, and watch as the plastic wrap that's completely clear at first becomes white because those reflections add on top of each other in the same way. And so, yeah, you end up with basically these little tiny individual highlights becoming something more like that. So streams are really difficult. We won't talk a lot about them other than that you should remember that the friction on the edges of the stream or rocks that are in the stream will change the way that the water is flowing. So the center of the stream moves quickly, the edges move slowly. And so because of that, you end up with these sort of V shapes. Anytime that you do features in the water, whether it's rapids or whatever else, they end up being pulled downstream in the center. And you end up with these kind of interlocking, you can see here, these kind of interlocking, stretching V shapes that are heading downstream. You can see it most pronounced there, right? But it gets very complicated because you've got the subsurface, you've got the transparency of the water, you've got the reflection on top of the water, which is causing all the, interesting reflection blue changes that are happening here. You've got the white water on top of the surface, on top of the waves, and you've also got white water underneath the surface. So these rapids are churning up bubbles that haven't come to the surface yet. And so you end up with this kind of white cloud in the center. And the color of the water shifts the color of that cloud as it goes down. So you get this kind of like deep atmosphere to it through that area. Streams are incredibly hard to paint, and I have students do it in my schoolism class, and it's really complicated. Most people really struggle with it. So I would say if you are going to be painting a stream, you'll want to use the methods that I'm going to show you in a minute, but you'll definitely want reference to because it's going to be tricky. And yeah, once you get past the rapids, or once the waves have crashed on shore, they just kind of leave this foam on top that is agitated by whatever water is left there. Don't forget that. It ends up really adding to the realism of the water once you put it in. There are other things that affect the water, like mineral deposits, life that's in the water, stuff like that. Now, water will have a tendency to make things darker just because that's what happens to most things when they get wet. And, then any additional stuff like buildup of minerals and things like that will be on top of that. So water, it is blue. Well, it's not. It's clear. It's transparent. But the two hydrogens on the oxygen molecule, they don't stay in one place. They flex. And as they do that, it causes, this is according to the explanations that I read, that flexing of the molecules causes kind of this really, it's a unique response to the water. And so instead of just being the same color as it gets deeper, it actually goes from being kind of a cyan, almost green, into these deep, dark blues. It actually rolls in the gradient. And you can definitely see it along the seashore here. You can see the beginning of that cyan color happening here. And if we had a very deep pool that went into, it would go from that cyan into a blue. But whether or not you see that color depends on what's underneath the water. So if there's just water underneath the water, you're out in the middle of the ocean, it will be a very deep, deep blue. But if you're near shore and it's got, you know, this light colored beach underneath, then you'll be seeing the beach through that water, but filtered, the colors will be filtered as according to the color of the water there. Obviously, if there's any dirt in the water or anything else, it will overpower that. I mean, you can see in this image here, it's a very soft, subtle effect, that coloring. And so if there's anything else, it'll overpower that. We won't talk about other things that go into water. So when you are rendering water, you need to handle all of these different elements on top of each other. Usually, and don't forget little intense sparkling reflections if the angle of your sun is right.
So wait, when is the angle of the sun right? Like when it's behind you, or?
Well, it depends on the waves. So if the sun is behind you and the waves are angled up like this so that they can bounce light back to your eye, then yeah, then the sun's there. But if the sun is there on the horizon and the waves are shaped like this, they can bounce off to your eye too. So the time when you won't get those little sparkling reflections is when the sun is over there and you're looking here, right? You know, whereas if you turned maybe even a little bit this way and you have the waves just right, you might be able to get a little bit of that sparkling happening. So yeah, I know that's not a very good answer, but it depends completely on the shape of the waves and the angle that you're looking at it from.
So would that be like a get reference kind of thing?
No, that would be do a sphere test for your lighting angle, figure out exactly where that specular reflection should be, and then only put the specular reflection where it's supposed to go in the water. So you'll have to imagine in your mind's eye what the waves are shaped like in order for that to work, but you can do that. Doesn't hurt to get reference, but you can do it without reference if you need to. So this is kind of an overcast scene. We don't have the sun, so this one doesn't deal with the sparkles. But I took this scene that has no water in it, and what I would do is I'd build layers on top of each other, because water is composed of all these different things. If I were doing water, I would always start with what's underneath the water first. You don't have to necessarily start with it completely like this. You could start with this, where you're painting kind of all the gunk and stuff that's already built up on everything if you wanted to. You can see, create mineral deposits up here that have dried out, and then the wet edge of the water and stuff like that. Then put in atmospheric effects, so as the water gets deeper, or if it's got stuff in it, that it's going to cause scattering to happen as it gets lower, or you'll just lose that stuff into darkness. Then caustics. So this is unrealistic, the caustics that are happening here. Most of the time, the caustics are going to be as a result of a direct light source. So if you have the sun, then you get caustics. If you don't have the sun, you don't really get caustics, because you've got a gigantic light source that's just kind of being scattered generally. You might get very soft caustics, but they wouldn't be noticeable. But I cheated them so that you could see them in this case. I'm going to make sure that the places where the waves are dipping and stuff, and you could totally make it up. The only thing is, you want to pay attention to the direction the water is flowing. If your waves are all going horizontally, and then you do your caustics going this direction, that's going to look funny. But other than that, you can cheat it. So reflections, what I would recommend to do, you can, just take a photo that already has the perspective that you want, and just basically create a black and white layer from it. And I'll show you how to do that in a second, maybe if we have time. But and then paint your scene in reverse onto that layer. Is one way that you could do that. You could just try to paint them in by hand, but I've always struggled when I try to do it that way. So I would probably use either. So I think in this case, I actually generated like a fractal pattern that kind of had a wave-like feeling to it, and then I distorted it in perspective so that it would fit onto the top of the water, and that works fine. You can do that as well. So the one thing that I didn't do here that I think is important is, let's drag this into Photoshop so we can show it. Oops, wrong one. So first thing is there's an edge that you need to respect, the edge where the water meets whatever the surface is, and you'll either get a little edge of reflection there, or you'll get little buildup of stuff, you know. And I'm using a white here so that you can see it, but this would probably be more of a gray or something for a scene like this. So you can see how on this water, it doesn't really feel like, you know, all this looks like water, but it doesn't feel like it's meeting the pillars or anything. And getting that little surface there helps do that. Now, yeah, that's too strong with the whites, but hopefully you get the idea. The other thing is, if the water is moving at all, you're going to end up with debris or a little, you know, you got to deal with like the white water or any other surface effects that are happening on the water. If you've got like the foam, or the bubbles that are running through the water, then you know you'll probably do that with something like this. So I'm just going to take a rounded airbrush here. I'm going to take well, let's assume that the sunlight is shining in here and hitting this water somewhere, and that I've got some water that got churned up by some rapids somewhere up there. So I'm going to make this a lighten layer, and I'm going to push it mostly toward green. So because of that, the way that water is changing the light, it's going to have a tendency, if you have like a fog like this, it's going to be warmer at the top and cooler at the bottom. And that's too strong overall. So we'll pull back. But that's probably how I would handle, you know, if there was stuff like bubbles underneath the surface. It doesn't look right in this place because I think in order for that to really work, you need the white water on top, or it doesn't feel like the bubbles are ever coming to the surface. So yeah, if I start to litter this thing with a little bit more, man, I've lost undo. There it goes. And when you're distributing stuff like this, you need to be falling back on the same principles you use when you're designing anything. Think in terms of rhythm, flow of line, stuff like that. If you don't, it's going to look funny no matter how you try. But hopefully you can see how tossing that stuff on top of the water justifies the warmer colors that are happening underneath it. Because we believe now that this is actually coming up to the surface and creating something else, right? Any questions?